Hello and welcome to this special episode of the National Security Conversations. In this episode, I will be speaking to retired Indian Ambassador Rakesh Sood and retired Pakistan Foreign Secretary Salman Bashir on the Lahore Agreement of 1999 between India and Pakistan and its relevance today. This is the 20th year of the Lahore Agreement and therefore an opportune time to think about the making of this particular agreement in 1999 and its contemporary relevance. Do recall that the visit of the Indian Prime Minister A.B. Vajpayee to Lahore came after a rather unfriendly period between the two nuclear neighbors and was followed by a period marked by even more animosity. And yet, the Lahore Agreement has had a defining impact and influence on the strategic relations between India and Pakistan ever since. So it might be useful to talk to the two minds who worked behind the scenes on the Lahore Agreement, on how the Lahore Agreement was reached and what is its contemporary relevance today. So welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Bashir and Ambassador Sood. Ambassador Sood, if I may begin with you, could you tell our viewers about how the Lahore Agreement was negotiated between the two governments? What went into the making of the Lahore Agreement, as it were?
As you know, India and Pakistan tested in May of 1998. The two Prime Ministers, Prime Minister Vajpayee and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, met for the first time bilaterally on the margins of the UN General Assembly in September of 1998. When they came out of that meeting, it was announced that they would start a direct bus service between Delhi and Lahore. And subsequently, over the next few months, both sides were engaged in trying to work out the modalities of the bus service. Sometime in January, actually, Prime Minister Vajpayee was planning to go to Amritsar, and it was thought that he would launch or inaugurate the first bus journey from Amritsar itself, because it is just close by. At that time, when the news came out, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif took the initiative and actually phoned Prime Minister Vajpayee and said, and this can only happen in the subcontinent. The phrase he used was that I understand that you are coming to Amritsar. In our culture, you cannot come to my doorstep and go back. I will receive you in Lahore at the border. And because, as you know, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif comes from Lahore. There was a usual discussion internally within the government in Delhi, and eventually Prime Minister Vajpayee felt that it would be a good gesture and he would go to Lahore. Then came the discussion as to what should be the outcome of the Lahore visit. Because it was one thing for...
How were you personally involved in all of this discussion?
So I was Joint Secretary dealing with disarmament, nuclear policy, arms control, non-proliferation, and I had been involved with the India-Pakistan Foreign Secretary level talks from 1990 onwards for the last 8 years. So once, because had Prime Minister Vajpayee actually flagged off the bus from Amritsar or from Delhi, then that would have been an event in itself. But if Prime Minister Vajpayee was actually going to go to Lahore and with a delegation, and they were going to spend a day or two of talks, then clearly there had to be a different and a more substantive outcome. So that was the genesis of the Lahore Declaration. We discussed it with the Pakistanis. The Pakistani High Commissioner sent back a message to his capital to ask their response. It was a positive response. And then, as time was running out, we were already in February, we started work on what became known subsequently as the Lahore Declaration.
Right. Ambassador Bashir, what are your recollections of the Lahore Agreement and the run-up to the Lahore Agreement?
Well, yes, first of all, I agree with Rakesh. I think that's exactly how it came about. I was at the luncheon meeting in New York between the two prime ministers when they decided that there would be this bus service, and at that point, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif said that it will be a good idea for him, for the Prime Minister of India, to visit Pakistan And he even offered that he will drive Prime Minister Vajpayee on the new motorway that we have between Lahore and Islamabad. I recollect that conversation.
Were there any quiet parleys between the two sides before that luncheon meeting in New York, or that was the first
No,
time
I
it was
think
raised?
they met to a lunch and we were all there, and it was not a very large group. But, well, of course, as Rakesh said, the decision of Prime Minister of India to visit Lahore was a momentous decision, given the context. Both India and Pakistan had been under considerable anxiety and pressures, not only starting with the launch of the Pakistani first missile Ghori, but then the nuclear tests of both sides, and then of course the international community. There was this particular situation, and I think there was a realization, the part of both, that they were for the first time perhaps faced with similar challenges. I think accompanying that was, of course, the realization that after the nuclearization of the subcontinent, things have to be done differently. And I think, therefore, as Rakesh said, some sort of new thinking was required. And of course, I was privileged to be sent by the Pakistan Foreign Ministry to meet with our counterparts led by Rakesh to Lahore to explore possibilities of an outcome document.
No, what I'm also trying to get at is whether any discrete back channel parleys between the two sides before the decision was made in New York.
No, I think it was agreed, as Salman mentioned, after the tests, both India and Pakistan were subjected to UN Security Council resolutions. And the US had also imposed sanctions on both India and Pakistan. The general perception, the global general perception was that these two countries will blow each other up very quickly, and also the rest of the world. And I think it was imperative that we wanted to convey a message that our leaders are responsible people, and that we were not going to be any more irresponsible. In fact, we would probably be more restrained in our nuclear posture. Prime Minister Vajpayee had already made an important speech in Parliament, sort of putting out the salient features of India's approach. And it was decided that the two prime ministers would meet. That in itself was a positive signal. And from there came the outcome. But then Lahore was more sudden, as it were, because that was a series of coincidences that led to Lahore. And once that was decided, then came the thinking of what should be an outcome.
There have been several strategic CBMs between India and Pakistan in the past before 1999. What makes Lahore agreement special?
Yeah, see, this what makes Lahore different is because in the past, all the CBMs that were negotiated between India and Pakistan, they were conventional CBMs, because while India suspected that Pakistan was a nuclear weapon state, and I dare say Pakistan suspected the same thing about India, but it was not something that was out in the open. And so therefore, there were no nuclear-related confidence-building measures. We had confidence-building measures like preventing airspace violations, or non-attack, or notification of troop movements and exercises, and so on. So what was different with Lahore was that for the first time, it was two nuclear weapon states, and they were directly also talking about nuclear confidence-building measures in addition to conventional confidence-building measures.
Right. Salman Sahab, Ambassador Sood mentioned that post the test, there was also a necessity to signal the rest of the world that India and Pakistan are responsible nuclear powers and they would exercise restraint. So this was communicated via the Lahore Agreement. Do you see that in the same way as Ambassador Sood sees it?
Well, yes, in a way, yes. I think because that was certainly the context, because there was tremendous international pressure, especially from the US, on both sides. And as Rakesh mentioned, there was the Security Council resolution in July 98, which applied equally to Pakistan and India. So, but I think much more basic and fundamental was a shift in thinking both in Islamabad and Delhi that there was the need now to deal with issues with a great sense of responsibility and maturity. I think that is the real reason why the Lahore meeting was important and why the Lahore document became something that, it sort of had that weight in those circumstances. And I'm happy to say that that is one of the instances where Pakistan and India were able to agree to a document which is of value for peace, stability in South Asia. And there, of course, there are two things. One is the Lahore Declaration. The other was a separate document called the MOU, which dealt with nuclear confidence building.
Do you think we have lived up to that commitment to the world that we will behave as responsible nuclear powers? We've had several crises thereafter. The 01-02 crisis, Mumbai crisis, and recently there have been crises. So I think we have sort of conveyed to the international community in 99 that this is how we are going to behave. Have we lived up to that expectation? What's your take?
Well, in terms of maturity and responsibility, to a certain extent, yes, because ever since overt nuclearization, we have had a period of peace in the sense that the resort to the use of force has not been an impulsive or not the best option to a certain degree. There have subsequently been developments which negated the optimism that existed in 99 regarding the stability that ought to follow in South Asia following the nuclear tests. Of course, first was the Kargil thing, and of course that sort of led to what we say a skirmish, but it was serious. And subsequently also, I think Pakistan-India relations have not moved in the desired trajectory as was perhaps envisaged at that time by the leadership of both countries. And I think I would like to give credit to Prime Minister Vajpayee, who demonstrated that he was a statesman, especially when he was in Lahore and he went to the Lahore fort and to the Iqbal mausoleum, where to Minar-e Pakistan, where he said that the partition wound had been healed. So I think that was a grand gesture on the part of the Indian Prime Minister.
Rakesh Sood, you have been writing and talking about the need that there should be no nuclear fear-mongering, as it were, in South Asia, that we are responsible nuclear powers. I mean, there have been several crises. People occasionally, politicians do talk about nuclear weapons in a responsible manner. How do you see that? Do you still stick to your argument about no need for a nuclear fear-mongering in South Asia?
I certainly do. And I'll tell you something. US went nuclear in 1945, Soviet Union went nuclear in 1949. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962. Right. And it was like a wake-up call. And it is then that the first confidence-building measure in the form of a hotline was established between Moscow and Washington. Now you compare that to the India-Pakistan case. Within a year, less than a year, you had actually a template of possible confidence-building measures established between India and Pakistan, with the Prime Minister of India going to Lahore and writing about healing the wounds of partition, as Salman said, at Minar-e Pakistan, which is the defining monument in Lahore. And I think, therefore, there was a very clear realization that yes, this does not solve all our differences. The Lahore Declaration or the MOU that was signed on confidence building measures was not that this was a panacea, there was a great solution and so on. But it was that we as responsible countries will solve our differences over a period of time, and we will not allow tensions to be escalated. And I think you're right that sometimes we see some irresponsible, I can only call them irresponsible statements about nuclear threats being held out and things like that. But I think by and large, I think we have shown that we have not tested any limits of deterrence. Deterrence has held, nuclear thresholds are valid. Pakistan is conscious of India's red lines, and India is conscious of Pakistan's red lines. And so therefore, any crises that have taken place have been resolved.
Do you agree with that assessment, that despite the crisis that we have had, conventional crisis that we have had, including the recent one, it has probably not created any nuclear emergency or the feeling of a desire to talk in the nuclear language in Pakistan? Is that your assessment as well?
No, I mean, the point is that, the last 20 years, as you mentioned, since 99 declaration, we have had our relations go see their ups and downs and all that, and there were periods of tension and all that. And I think there is perhaps the realization, more acute now than there ever was, that there is the need for doing something more in terms of developing what was envisaged in Lahore in 1999 in terms of issues relating to strategic stability, accidental release of weapons or systems. All of that was very much in our minds when we were drafting those documents. It was to be a starting point for a much deeper substantive engagement. One would have hoped that both sides would have worked towards elaborating those mechanisms. For instance, there is certainly the need to have post-Balakot, to talk about the more recent incidents, a crisis prevention and crisis management standing mechanism between Pakistan and India. Both countries, especially I think in periods of crisis, have resorted to one means or another to either communicate their intentions or to sort of assure each other by varied means, what is called signaling. But I think, again, I think certainly in my view, there is the need to have some sort of a permanent mechanism, an institutional mechanism to deal with these aspects.
Susab, I think the argument is that the Lahore MOU contains a lot of promising statements. For example, the two sides shall engage in bilateral consultations on security concepts and nuclear doctrines with a view to developing measures for confidence building in the nuclear and conventional fields. The two sides shall conclude an agreement on prevention of incidents at sea, etc., etc. But we haven't seen much progress in this direction in the last several years. In fact, even the expert level groups that used to meet between the Indian and Pakistani sides have ceased their meetings. So what do you make of that?
Well, no instrument, no piece of paper can actually be divorced in terms of what it stands for in its implementation from the political mood that exists in both countries. And it is a fact that during the last 20 years, we have seen periods when there has been a positive environment, when there has been dialogue, and we have seen periods when there has been no dialogue.
So what comes first? Positive political environment comes first, and then agreements, or is it the other way around?
There was a political will in Lahore. Subsequently, we signed agreements on notification of ballistic missile tests. Right. Now, that was something which we were able to make, capitalize on the momentum and be able to negotiate that quickly. Subsequently, there was another agreement on notification regarding accidental launches or anything like that, so that the other side should not jump to the worst case conclusions. So, but then there were other things that were also promised which have not yet seen the light of day. And we will need to wait for a political opportune moment where we can take up the dialogue, because that is what is essential. And in order to then ensure that the instrumentalities that are put into place are so robust that they stand the ups and downs of the day-to-day political challenges between the two countries.
But you do think that it is important to take some of these statements mentioned in the MOU, Lahore MOU, to the next level?
Oh, absolutely. It is still a very valid document, because, as you said, there are elements of it which have not yet been implemented. They still need to be implemented.
Salman Sahab, do you think the Lahore Declaration is still relevant in the wake of the Uri crisis and the Balakot strikes?
I think it has become even more relevant. I think there are times then when both countries need to revert back to what they have been able to achieve at points in history, in terms of understandings or agreements. I think they certainly retain a lot of value, and I think there is a treasure trove of documents between Pakistan and India dealing with such stuff which is equally important to both. There are some mechanisms that have been in place and which are still working, which ought to work more regularly, more robustly, such as the mechanisms between the Coast Guards and the Maritime Security Agency, the BSF and the Rangers, the DGMO's communication line. I think all of these are things that are of relevance and which need to be sort of preserved and developed further. So I don't take a zero-sum view of Pakistan-India history in this domain, because there was a lot of things that were accomplished in the past. And allow me to say something which probably just for the record and for the archives to you, that when we met in Lahore, myself and Rakesh, we were able to draft in half a day an agreement on the non-use of force between the two of us, just to give you the mood at that time. We thought that we were now at a qualitatively different stage where we could be bold enough to venture and exchange drafts on that. Of course, it was not taken up, but I am saying this just for the record because it doesn't really figure in Pakistan history, India history in any substantial way. But that's how it is. I think that was the spirit that
so
we
what does
needed.
that mean? Does that show that if there is a certain political will, the two sides can easily choke out their differences and so come out with an agreement?
That's the first thing. I think we need to sort of develop this will, and I think there are abundant reasons and elements which could be utilized to fully, mature this sort of political will. Of course, there are differences between Pakistan and India, but there are, in fact, lots of points of convergence between the two peoples. So I think it's just sort of finding the right balance. The political will, of course, is essential to do anything in terms of taking the relationship on a positive trajectory forward.
Ambassador Sood, there is absolutely no dialogue happening, at least in a major way, between India and Pakistan at this point of time. But looking at what has been happening in the recent past, is it time for a Lahore-like reach out at this point of time, given the fact that even the 99 Lahore Agreement came in the wake of a major crisis? So is it probably the time to have another magnanimous Lahore-like reach out?
Well, whether it is a highly visible political event like Lahore, which means a summit-level meeting between the two prime ministers, or whether it is more modest incremental steps, I think that is something that the politics of the moment will decide. But I think there is a basic realization which underlay Lahore, which was that a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan is disastrous for both countries. And I think we have to begin by reiterating that basic realization and then see that irrespective of our differences, yes, we have different views on Kashmir, we have disputes on other matters, etc., etc. We have disagreements on terrorism, things like that. But the recourse is not nuclear escalation. And I think that is the key that has to be accepted. Now, how we then build upon the elements of Lahore to create a more stable nuclear environment in this region, that is the challenge.
Ambassador Bashir, is it the time for a Lahore-like reach out?
I think certainly this is the time for a reach out of sorts which is substantive. As Rakesh said, whether it is the summit level or it is, taken in stride, developed at the experts level, going to the officials, whatever, irrespective of the methodology. But there is and I think more than anything else, we owe it to ourselves.
Right.
I think both Pakistan and India belong to a rich civilization, a civilization that has its own merits, has its own positives and strengths. And let's not just imitate or copy doctrines and concepts that are coming from elsewhere. And I think we ought to take responsibility for ourselves, for our region.
Wonderful talking to you, Ambassador Bashir.
Thank you, sir.
Ambassador Sood, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.